Before I read the scripture, I just want to say a quick word of how delighted I am to be back at BPC in person with people in the garden, streaming video at home, but also many in the sanctuary today in person. And I can sum up how I feel in one word. Whoopee! It's great to be back. Well, the Baseball Hall of Fame is in Cooperstown, New York. The Pro Football Hall of Fame is in Canton, Ohio. The Basketball Hall of Fame is in Springfield, Massachusetts. But the Hall of Fame of Faith is in Hebrews chapter 11. And in Hebrews 11, the author of Hebrews lists all these great people of faith, men and women who faced adversity and suffering and challenges, but they faced these things with a strength based on faith. And the author's holding them up as exemplars, saying they weren't perfect people, as Dave just said so beautifully, but what they had in common was they relied on God to see them through. They realized they couldn't make it on their own. They had faith in God who saw them through. And now we get to Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And after all these great people in Hebrews 11 that were mentioned, we get to this verse in Hebrews 12, 1 to 2, which I think is going to come up on your screen here. And this is the verse for today. But the background is all these great people of faith listed in Hebrews 11. So the author of Hebrews 12 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely. And let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Would you pray with me? Oh God, if there's anyone here today who needs a word of comfort, a word of challenge, a word of hope, please meet every one of us at our point of need so that we might be empowered by you to take our next step on the journey of faith. To that end, bless and anoint these words, and we know you will, for we pray with anticipation in the strong name of Jesus, the risen and the reigning Christ. And may all the people of God say, amen. Well, the balcony of the church that I served in New Providence, New Jersey, went all the way around the sanctuary on three sides. There was an unwritten rule that the junior high school kids would sit in the left-hand balcony and the high school kids would sit on the right-hand balcony. Now, one year during the Olympic Games, everybody was watching the track and field competition and other Olympic events, but people were particularly riveted on the gymnastics competition. Because maybe you remember when a gymnast performs, the judges would confer, and then the score would come up on the electronic scoreboard, 9.1, 9.2, 9.3. Well, the Sunday after the gymnastics events, I preached a sermon. And when I finished the sermon, I walked down to sing the final hymn, and I noticed laughter and giggling in the congregation, and people were pointing up to the right balcony, the senior high balcony. And I looked up there, and one of the senior high kids, after my sermon, held up a scorecard, a big poster board that said 9.8. Another held up a sign that said 9.9. I was feeling pretty good about their evaluation of my preaching until I realized that both those kids were going into their senior year of high school, and both of them had asked me to write a college letter of recommendation for them. Then one of the high school advisors put up his sign, 2.4. I've been trying to excommunicate that guy for years. Now, the author and theologian, Dr. Carlyle Marney, made a brilliant observation about life, and he employed the metaphor of a balcony to do it. Marney says that embedded deep within every human being is a desire to be blessed, a desire to be all that we can be. And Marney says that God, by God's grace, puts in our life balcony people who can sit around and they call forth gifts in us that we didn't know we had. And the delightful name Marney gives these people is balcony people. Balcony people sit in the balcony of our life, and they observe us, and they call forth from us gifts that we may not even have known we had. I wish I could talk to every one of you today about who's been a balcony person in your life. It would be wonderful to get an answer to that question. But I'll bet you would tell me about high school teachers, music teachers, drama coaches, people in college, professors, people who taught you in graduate school, supervisors in the business world, colleagues, office mates, roommates, family members, grandparents, parents, friends, neighbors, somebody who called forth from you a gift that you may not have even ever thought that you had, but they called forth this gift from you and you blossomed as a result of it. Who's been a balcony person in your life? Hetz Marsh has been a balcony person in my life. Hetz was a student at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary when my mother and father and I were members of Southminster Church in Pittsburgh, and he came to our church to work with a high school youth group. And Hetz was a balcony person in my life. He started a program for high school kids called Basketball and Bible Study. And to be really honest, I didn't care at all about the Bible study in those days, but I did care a lot about basketball. It was my favorite sport. And Hetz Marsh was just known in the city of Pittsburgh as a great basketball player. He played high school ball. He was all city. He played college basketball. He was a wonderful player, so we all wanted to play basketball with him. So that summer, he offered this basketball and Bible study. But as the summer went on, the basketball got shorter and the Bible study got longer at our request, actually. Because in the book of Romans that we study, there's all these amazing questions like theodicy. If God is sovereign and good, why is there evil in the world? Why is there suffering in the world? Or predestination, or knowing the will of God. We were fascinated by all these questions, so the Bible study got longer as the summer went on. The last night of the summer, I'll never forget this. Hetz Marsh drove me home, and we sat in my driveway, my parents' driveway. We were in our sweaty sweatsuits from playing basketball. And he asked me a question that changed my life. He said, "Tom, have you ever thought about being a minister?" I answered honestly, why would anybody want to be a minister? He said, "Well, I'll tell you why. It's the only profession in the world where you have the privilege of being with people at the very best and the very worst times of their life. If they get married, they call you to do the wedding. If they're going through a hard time or get a divorce, they often call you for some comfort and help and sympathy. If they have a baby, they call you for a baptism. And if there's an illness in their family, they call you to come to the hospital. And if a loved one dies, you often come to the home or the hospital room, and you may be the first one there, other than a family member, to be with that family when that loved one died. You may be there at the very height and the very depth of their life, and you're not trying to sell them life insurance or a financial package. You're just walking alongside them, and you're representing God in their life. And Tom, you obviously like theology. I think you like people, as I have observed you, and I think you would love to be with people at the best and worst times of their life. But don't let me lay this on you. I'm not saying it's something you have to do. It's like a sport coat. Try it on for size. And let Southminster Church be an arena in which you can try this on for size and see whether or not it fits. And I'll give you honest feedback. People in the church will give you honest feedback. But this is what the church is all about, Tom. It's a nurturing community of faith in which you can discover your gifts and figure out who you are. Make no mistake about it. One of the most identifiable marks of a vital church, and we're studying the vital church right now, is a nurturing community of faith in which people can discover their gifts. One of the many, many things I love about Brentwood Presbyterian Church is this is a community of faith where you can come with your questions and your doubts and your fears and your worries. And you can maybe be in other churches, or maybe you didn't grow up in the church, and you can come here and you can talk about things in SCL and here on Sunday mornings that maybe you couldn't talk about with any other human being. But this is such a welcoming, nurturing community of faith. You feel like you can be honest about every aspect, every area of your life. It's a nurturing community of faith in which people can blossom and they can try on suits of clothes and figure out who they are, what their gifts are, how they can serve God with those gifts in the world. Now, for the last 10 years or more, I've been actually privileged to be a consultant for churches of many different denominations across America. I've worked with over 20 different denominations and well over 100 churches. But it's interesting, I've worked with Presbyterians and Lutherans and Methodists, Roman Catholics. I've even worked with Cooperative Baptists. Whenever I mention the word Cooperative Baptist, people always say, well, does that mean there's uncooperative Baptists? And believe me, I've worked with a lot of uncooperative Baptists, I'll tell you. But after all this work with churches, I can tell you categorically, BPC is a nurturing community of faith. There's no doubt of why this is called the warm heart of the West Side. You've got pastors, Dave Carpenter and Laura East, who are balcony people. I've seen them do it. They call forth gifts in the congregation, and they help you become who you were meant to be. I'll bet if many of you were to list who's a balcony person in your life, you would put Dave and Laura on your list. I'll bet many people would put Catherine Levitt on your list. Catherine's a balcony person. You can see it in the way she deals with the musicians and the choir. She calls forth the gifts in them. She not only sings the music, she feels the music. Catherine moves when she's directing the music. And everybody loves that because she feels it, she embodies it. But she's a balcony person calling out the gifts in Nancy and in Andrew and in Glenn and all these musicians. She's calling out the gifts. She's a balcony person. Do you know that God wants every one of us to be a balcony person? In whose balcony are you sitting? You know, if I were to ask other people at Brentwood, California, but also at Brentwood Presbyterian Church, who's a balcony person, they might mention you. You may not have any idea that you're a balcony person in their life, but they might mention you because you've had a profound influence on them. Maybe it was just a question you asked them or a comment that you made one time about a gift they had, but you could be a balcony person in somebody's life. Every one of us is intended to be that. So this morning I want us to just look very quickly at 3 characteristics of balcony people. And every balcony person has these 3 characteristics, and we need them if we're to call forth the gifts in people and be a part of a nurturing community of faith. The first quality of balcony people is we lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely. Oh, I wish I could take a walk with you or have a cup of coffee as we talk about balcony people, because I'd also love to ask you, what is holding you back? You know what I mean. Is there something weighing you down? Guilt, anxiety, worry, fear? Is there something holding you back from being the fullness of the person who God created you to be? Unless I miss my guess, there's somebody here today who's got some resentment or bitterness or envy or jealousy just below the surface. And every now and then, under a moment of stress, when you least expect it, when everything is caving in on you, you erupt and this anger erupts and you wonder, where in the world did that come from? Well, you're carrying around resentment and bitterness and envy and jealousy and anger, and it's below the surface. And if you don't put it in check or don't let go of it or don't deal with it in some way in therapy or getting some exercise and getting it out, it's going to erupt in some way. The author of Hebrews 12 is saying, you've got to lay aside these weights and sins that cling so closely and weigh you down. Anybody ever try to keep a beach ball underwater in the deep end of a swimming pool? You can do it, but it takes all the energy you got. And you're trying to keep this down below so nobody sees it. If you can let it out and deal with it and name it, let go of it, it's a lot lighter. My friend George McCausland needed a balcony person in his life. He had something that was weighing him down. It was workaholism. He was overworked. He was an overachiever. At the age of 48, he became director of the largest YMCA in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my hometown. And George McCausland was known all over the city as a brilliant marketer and program director and fundraiser. He raised a lot of money for the Y, but it was killing him. He was not working 40 or 50 hours a week. He was working 60, 70, 75 hours a week, and his wife was a balcony person. She was trying to say, George, you got to cut this out. His doctor was saying, George, you got to cut this out. And the doctor said one day, almost prophetically, George, you're going to have a heart attack if you don't cut this out. And a year later, George did have a heart attack, and he almost died. When the doctor was releasing him from the hospital after they cleaned out his arteries and fixed his heart as best they could, he said, George, I got to talk real turkey with you, man. You're killing yourself. George said, yeah, I want to slow down, but how do I do it? I'm in charge of marketing and programming, and I got all these kids and all these adults and all these programs. I'm raising millions of dollars for the Y in Pittsburgh. I got so much on my plate. I'm bearing the weight of the world on my shoulders, and I'm the executive director of the biggest Y in Pittsburgh. And the doctor said, and George, I hate to break it to you, but you're going to be the former director of the biggest Y in Pittsburgh. George, you're going to be dead. And let me tell you, your wife has only one husband. And your kids have only one dad. But this Y could get another executive director in a heartbeat. And the reason they could is you've done a great job and you've built a great program, but they could get somebody else to do this job and they'll forget about you. So George, I want you to get 2 days a week off, work no more than 8 hours a day, no more than 40 hours a week max. I want you to get more sleep, more rest. I want you to take all your vacation. And George, you got a decision to make. You're either going to be dead or you're going to do this. So George went home and he thought about it, he prayed about it, he got out a piece of paper and a pen and he wrote God a letter. And he said, "Dear God, I hereby resign as general manager of the universe. Love, George." And George McCausland told me with some emotion, "Wonder of wonders, God accepted my resignation." Is there anybody here other than me who needs to resign as general manager of the universe? You kind of get the feeling you're indispensable, that people can't do without you. Well, the reality is control is an illusion. Being in charge is an illusion. Nobody's in control except God. Your life, my life could change this afternoon in a minute. I remember vividly in January, a year ago, I was preaching at this church, and I got out in my car and turned on my phone, and I got a text from my son, "Dad, isn't it a shame about Kobe Bryant?" I'm thinking, what happened to Kobe Bryant? Well, he died in a helicopter crash. While we were having the worship service, he died. Your life could change, my life could change in a second. Nobody's indispensable. So the first thing we got to do, if we're going to encourage other people, lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely. Second thing we've got to do is run with perseverance the race that is set before us. Everybody's got a race that they're running, a challenge they're facing. For some, the challenge is an illness. It's a race called illness. It's an illness that you're facing. Or it's an illness a loved one is facing. Maybe you've got a parent or a spouse who's got stage 3 or stage 4 of cancer. Maybe you've got a spouse or a parent who's dealing with dementia or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Maybe you're the caregiver for that family member, primary caregiver. Or maybe your family member is hundreds or thousands of miles away and you can't get to them and spend the kind of time with them you want to spend, and you feel guilty about that and you're having to run a race with that in it. Or maybe you got to run a race with a child in it, and that child is in a particularly needy time in their life and they need you and they need your time, and that's a race you've got to run right now. I'll bet somebody's got a race at the office that they got to run. And there's a tough decision that's got to be made. And this decision is going to impact lots of people. And you've got to help to make that decision, or you got to make it yourself. And it's a race you've got to run. It's going to impact the lives of a lot of people. You got to run that race. What's the name of the race you've got to run? See, so often we look at other people's races and we say, "Gee, I wish I could be running that race because that's a more glamorous race." But there's a race that every one of us has to run. And the author of Hebrews 12 says, "Run with perseverance the race that is set before us." Not somebody else's race, the race that's set before us. Henrietta Mears was right over here at Hollywood Presbyterian Church for so many years. Maybe you've heard the name. She was a great Christian educator, one of the greatest Christian educators who ever lived, the author of some Sunday school curriculum. But Henrietta Mears had a critical streak in her. And she needed a balcony person not only to encourage her, but to point out that if she didn't get rid of that critical streak, she wasn't going to be very good at anything she did. She was critical. But her mother, who was a balcony person in her life, said something to her when she was 12 years old that changed Henrietta's life. Henrietta went to a birthday party, and when Henrietta came home, the mother said to her, "Honey, how was the birthday party?" Henrietta said it was terrible. And the mother said, "How can a birthday party be terrible?" Henrietta said, "Oh, the guest list was lame. The people they invited weren't the cool kids. And actually, you know, the games they played were just childish and juvenile. And the party favors were nothing. Even the cake and ice cream wasn't very good. It was a terrible party. It was a complete waste of time." That's when Henrietta's mother asked her the question she never forgot. She said, "And what did you do to make the party better, Henrietta?" And it brought Henrietta Mears up short. She finally realized that maybe she could contribute something to make the party a little livelier. And she said after that, every Sunday school class she ever taught, she always said to herself, "And what did you do to make the class better, Henrietta?" And every time she was tempted to be critical of a worship service, she asked herself, "And what did you do to make that worship service better, Henrietta?" And every time she was critical of a relationship, a person in the church that was bugging her, she said, "And what did you do to make that relationship better, Henrietta?" She heard her mother, the balcony person in her life, not only encouraging her, but in correcting her to have a bigger world and realize she could make an impact on the races she was called to run in churches and with curriculum in Sunday school classes. What's the race you're called to run and I'm called to run. It might be a hard race. Now, it might be a sprint. It might be only for a few weeks or months or maybe 9 months or a year. You're called to run this race, and then you'll be called to run another race. Or maybe, I hate to say, maybe it's a marathon. Maybe you got a family member with an illness and it's going to last for a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. And this is a long race. You got to get geared up for the marathon. But if we're going to be balcony people and help other people, we got to lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely. We got to run with perseverance, the race that is set before us. And the third thing we got to do is looking to Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. Again, if we could have a conversation, I'd like to ask you the question, whose approval do you most need? Whose approval do you most want? Whose approval, be honest, are you trying to get, but you never quite feel like you measure up to who that person wants you to be? Whose approval are you desperate for? Next Sunday's Father's Day. Are you desperate for your father's approval? Maybe you never got it. Are you desperate for your mother's approval? Are you desperate for a spouse's approval or somebody you're dating's approval or a partner or a friend or a colleague at the office or your boss? Whose approval do you most look to? What the author of Hebrews is saying is we play to an audience of one. We may have many balcony people in the balcony, but there's only one ultimate balcony person. There's only one person whose opinion matters, and that is God, the God revealed in Jesus Christ. Who do you look to when the chips are down? Because there's only one opinion that matters. So 25 years ago this summer, one of the greatest events in the Olympic Games ever was held in Atlanta, Georgia, 1996. Maybe you remember this event. The United States was locked in the women's gymnastics final competition with the Soviet Union. Russia had won many gold medals. The United States had never won a gold medal in women's gymnastics. And it all came down to the last event. The Russians were on the floor exercise, and they performed, and all their scores were tabulated. The United States was on the vault, and all their scores were tabulated. But it all came down to one woman, Carrie Strug. And she did her first vault, and she landed awkwardly and sideways, and she sprained her ankle, and it hurt. And she didn't know if she could continue, and she knew they were locked in a battle for the gold medal. She said to her coach, Bella Crowley, Coach, do you really need me to do this last vault? I'm not sure I can do it. I think I sprained my ankle. And the coach said, Carrie, we need you. We know we not only need you to vault, we need a good score from you. And Carrie said, well, what score do we need? And he said, I don't know, but it's got to be a pretty good score, probably 9.4 maybe. It's got to be a big score. And Carrie Strug ran to the end of the line, and her ankle was throbbing, and she knew if she stuck that landing, it was going to hurt. So she stood at the end of the runway, and she looks at the vault and imagines doing it in her mind, and all she had to do, and the landing she had to stick. And at that moment, she looked over at her coach. And as she looked at Bella Caroli, maybe you remember this, he yells to her, Carrie, you can do it. Carrie Strug stood up straight and tall as if she got kind of a supernatural strength, and she ran down that runway. She went up to that vault, and she did a somersault and twisted in the air, and she stuck the landing, and it hurt. It throbbed. She signaled to the judges, she smiled, and then she collapsed in a heap. They had to carry her off. And sitting next to her coach, they flashed, the judges did, the scores on the scoreboard. 9.71. The United States of America won the gold medal, and they won it in the mind of the ultimate balcony person for her, Bella Caroli. But our ultimate balcony person is Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is saying to us, calling us by name, you can do it. You really can do it. And so every one of us is standing at the edge of a runway, at the edge of a challenge. COVID is winding down, but we're at the end of that runway. We've got to go up. We've got challenges to face, and we've got a vault ahead of us, and we've got to stick the landing, and we've got to do it to the best of our ability. And as we do, how do we do this? Well, we lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, worry, anxiety, fear. We run with perseverance the race that is set before us, not somebody else's race, not somebody else's event, the race that is set before us. And who do we look to? We look to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Because I tell you the truth, someday, every one of us, I mean this, is going to stand before Jesus Christ. And when we stand before Jesus Christ, he is not going to hold up a sign that says 9.8 or 2.4. Thank God. He's going to say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." My dear friends at Brentwood Presbyterian Church, those are the only words in all the world worth living for.